Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Perspectives on Sustainable Development, episode number 10. 10. I can't believe that. This whole year is going by so incredibly fast. And by now, if you listen to this program, you know my story, how I got involved in air quality work, how I really found my passion, frankly, in environmental justice, cumulative impacts work around 6 years ago. And you know that story, but you don't necessarily know yet some of the other stories that have helped guide me along the way and have guided so many throughout the various processes in environmental justice and trying to get this movement started, frankly, before I was even born in some cases. The history of those people who started this thing and been pushing that giant rock up the hill over so many years is very, very important to know for a lot of reasons. But the only real way to understand it or even take anything away from it could be valuable to yourselves is if you hear directly from those involved. So today we have an opportunity to learn from two incredibly passionate, smart women who've been doing this a very, very long time and give them opportunity to tell their stories and to talk about how the changes we saw recently at the federal level might unfortunately be a hindrance temporarily or not in some of the work that they're getting into and have been doing for so long. But before I get into any of that stuff, it's with a great honor that I have to introduce Vernice Miller-Travis, Executive Vice President, Metropolitan Group, and co-founder of WeAct, and also Adrienne Hollis, Vice President of National Wildlife Federation. I gave you an extraordinarily brief intro, but if you can both take a few minutes and talk about your backgrounds and how and why you first decided to get into this work.
Okay, Bernice, you want to go first since I was afraid of you when I started doing this work.
She tells that it's a myth that Adrienne tells. I started in this work as a researcher, working alongside Charles Lee at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, helping to write and produce the what would become a landmark report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. And I started working there in early summer of 1986 through 1987 when we published the report. And while I was working on the report, I met some folks. I was directed to meet up with some folks in my own community in West Harlem in New York City. And they were building this, I was told, this independent Democratic Party political organization. And at first I balked because I didn't want to be a part of Democratic Party politics in New York. And after months of dragging my feet, I went to a meeting one evening in the neighborhood. And I walked in the door and they were talking about fighting the siting of the North River sewage treatment plant on our Hudson River waterfront. And before that meeting was over, I joined the organization that night. And the founders of that organization were Peggy Shepard and the late Chuck Sutton. And a couple of years later, we would go on to build WeAct, West Harlem Environmental Action, now WeAct for Environmental Justice. And I had the great privilege to be a part of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, as was Adrienne. And I served on the drafting committee that wrote the principles of environmental justice and was the first director of environmental justice at NRDC and the first program officer for environmental justice at the Ford Foundation, and on and on and on and on and on. But I think the thing that I is my touchstone is fighting in my own neighborhood, and that fight's still going on 38 years later.
And that's a great background, everybody, but it also drives home the point that I, I've I'll be extremely upfront about this. I've only been as invested as I currently am on environmental justice topics ever since the New Jersey EJ law 6 or 7 years ago. And I've been that's it's become what I want to do and what I'm passionate about. But people have been on this for literally 4 decades. That's important to remember because there's still too many people who think EJ just kind of popped up a few years ago. And that's not the case for 1,000 reasons. But thank you, Vernice. And Next, actually, Adrian.
Yes, sure, sure. So I always tell the story of when I was little and we couldn't go to the beach in Pensacola. I was born in Mobile, Alabama, and it wasn't written anywhere, but everybody knew, all the people of color, black people mostly, that we couldn't go to Pensacola Beach. And so we went to this little place we called it a beach, but it really wasn't. It was like a hole, and the water was black and because it was right near the state docks. And Bernice has heard this story many times about my white swimsuit. I was a little girl, so it wasn't a bikini. It was just a two-piece. And I was in the water maybe 5 minutes at most and came out and it was black and it was never white again. And I remember thinking how unfair it was that we couldn't go where the water was blue and clean and which it was at that time. And then, so that was my first, I think, real exposure to, no pun intended, to the issue. And then I think the most telling thing before I went to the great meeting that Bernice mentioned, I was doing it seemed like my whole dissertation and my postdoc, everything focused on protecting the lung from infection. So my work when I was at Harvard was on ozone pollution in the lung and how to protect the lung. And I remember going to my professor, Dr. Brain, do some research, told me to do some research on advertising and targeted advertising. And what I found was that that young black people were targeted differently than young whites. And the advertising was at eye level. There was more of it in the community. It was more about you'll be cool if you smoke cigarettes and things like that. And for in the other communities, it would be up on a building, not, it would be out of sight, and it would be adults that like the Marlboro Man, right? And things like that. So that was when I really became I think that was the beginning, and I think about that a lot. I never mentioned that part before, but I would say that that's when you reach that point where you know you have to do something. So,
No, that's a great image, and as unfortunate as that is, I think that also makes it hit home to the unfortunate impact that a lot of this has had over the years. Um,
Can I say a little bit more about Dr. Hollis?
yeah, please,
no.
please.
Because she's so modest. Um, but from that experience of growing up in Mobile, she took that to Meharry Medical College. She got a PhD. She's a toxicologist. She's done her postdoc at Harvard School of Public Health. She's been a regulator for ATSDR. She was one of the first instructors, teachers, professors at the um, FAMU Environmental Justice Center, which was one of the earliest environmental justice centers.
Mm,
Dr. Hollis has done a lot, but the thread I just want people to know is that the first place that it hits you, if you have the experience of growing up in a place that has environmental harms and threats, somehow, if you are so inclined, it takes a hold of you and it will direct you where you need to go. And I think both Dr. Hollis and I were directed
Yeah.
in terms of a career into where we needed to be and where we were supposed to go.
Yeah. And that is true. And Chris, just keeping it with that thread. I mean, my mom is, and I mentioned to you, a six-time cancer survivor, and a lot of us are strong believers in the fact that the pollution that we grew up around, that they grew up around, right near Africa Town, which is where my mom lived, near Africa Town, is a direct. You can directly correlate that with the number of people who've died from respiratory illnesses, from unusual cancers that are supposedly rare, and things of that nature, because they lived in the middle of all of the pollution
mm.
that people have been fighting. And it wasn't the Environmental Justice Institute, it was the Institute of Public Health,
Thank you.
which is different. One is the one floor below the other one.
Okay.
So,
Hey,
but
same
still
building.
good. Yeah, same
Same
building,
building.
exactly. Same people too. You would know them. But yeah, so and Chris, when we talk about for a lot of people, I think it has a personal connection.
Yeah.
This work, it has to.
No, absolutely. And that sense of place is so important for a lot of reasons. And over the years, again, just going back to my background, air quality, if you look at trending maps over that last couple of decades, as a country, things are improving. Concentrations of ambient air going down, all great, but there's still a lot of work to do and still many, many hotspots and overburdened areas that didn't get the same attention. And
Yeah.
frankly, that's why I'm as passionate as I am as to try to get the public policy right to do a permitting law that can take on cumulative impacts. So I just kind of wonder if you both want to speak for a minute as to any types of positive changes you've noticed over the years, what things are getting better, and then possibly also what things, I'm sure there are unfortunately many that still aren't getting better and still have to actually be addressed.
Yeah. I,
Well,
yeah.
one demonstrable thing for us is that while we started our work for West Harlem Environmental Action, fighting the sewage treatment plant and the siting of this giant sewage treatment plant, I should say that it's 10 city blocks long and I don't know how many stories high, but it was designed to treat 180 million gallons of raw sewage and wastewater daily, to help restore the health of the Hudson River, which it has largely done, the lower Hudson River. But it was built with no odor control devices because why would the 100,000 people that lived adjacent to it, why would they need clean, non-sewer fetid sewage odor permeating their homes, their communities, their schools, their businesses, etc.? Why would we need odor control devices? And EPA signed off on that twice, EPA Region 2. So that was our focus, was the sewage treatment plant. And we would have these public meetings every month with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Occasionally, EPA would show up as well. And these meetings went on for 8 years. For, I'd say, from 1986 until roughly 1992. So what's that, 6 years? We're still focused on shutting down the sewage treatment plant. But the community members are only talking about asthma, right? They're only talking about respiratory disease. And I don't care how many presentations we had. I don't care how many experts we had come. I don't care who we had show up. They only wanted to talk about asthma. So we joined up with the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, a former college classmate of mine. I went to Barnard at Columbia undergrad, and one of my former classmates at Columbia College was by then a physician. He had gone to medical school at Columbia, and he was a physician in a pulmonary medicine clinic at Harlem Hospital, the local municipal hospital where I was born and where both of my parents worked. And I reached out to him to say, this asthma issue seems to be off the charts. And it's all people want to talk about. Do you know anything about this, Sean? His name is Dr. John Ford. And he said, oh my goodness, we just applied for and won a grant from the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences to do a household asthma survey in Central Harlem because they were getting such a volume of admissions to the hospital for people with asthma, babies, children, young adults, elderly folk, every age group. And it was just like a tsunami for them. And I said, well, you need to include some census tracts in West Harlem because that's where the source of the pollution is. All of this is to say that turns out we had the highest level of exposure to PM 2.5 of any community in the nation. We had the highest incidence of asthma of any community in the nation. And we had the highest rate of premature death from asthma of any community in the nation. Now, the community, they knew something was wrong. But in our minds, we just knew that the issue was the sewage treatment plant. And the sewage treatment plant was not a big source of PM 2.5, diesel exhaust, but it was an odor issue more than it was an ambient air pollution issue. But to close this circle, Chris, that is not the case anymore. Our community is not number one on that hit list. There's been a significant reduction in the sources of PM 2.5 and a significant improvement in the overall air quality in the community. And there's no doubt in my mind that had it not been for our advocacy, had it not been for us finally listening to our residents, we would never have gotten there. And And, so the New York State Department of Health and the New York City Department of Health knew we were in crisis, but nobody ever said anything to us.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And for me, I think sort of related. My brother, one of my brothers, and some other family members, and my neighbors, little kids, all had asthma growing up. And we were so poor that our parents couldn't afford medication. So they would hold the babies, the little kids over the bathtub and run the hot water and hope that that would open up the airways. And it did for the most part, you know. And, but once again, it was about where we were living and things of that nature. That people were, as Bernice said, were talking about this and people weren't listening. One of the positive changes I see is that community organizations are talking and backed up, and their data, their information is backed up by data, scientific data. And I love that they've always had data, but it's become recognized, which is a battle, because it was, oh, the data was dismissed because it wasn't scientific enough or didn't have a study behind it, whatever. But you also have historical knowledge, and that's just as important. And I see that questions about cumulative exposure, those questions have been around for years, and I mean many, many years, but only in the last few years is it getting attention? Is it getting enough attention? No, but it's getting more than it was. And so I see those positive changes in data, and maybe I'm speaking as a scientist, but I see that the tools we need to address the changes are, we're increasing the tools we have at our disposal to do that. So
I would agree with that. But part of me is still hesitant, frankly, and that might not be the right word for it, but especially for people who don't have engineering backgrounds or science backgrounds, all this data, all these numbers, all these monitoring reports might eventually just get to be too much. So is there the capability or the capacity to support the average community member out there who knows from their experience that something just isn't right and they think it might be from the plant down the street? As the example Vernice gave, that was a very glaring thing. You have this giant plant down the street, chances are it might be causing some of your problems.
yeah,
But there are other cases where you have a dozen smaller ones and mobile sources in the area still
Yeah.
causing issues. So how
yeah,
do you try to untangle all of that if you're just, I don't know, Joe Smith?
yeah. And, you don't have to, and Bernice, I'll jump in first. You don't have to have a scientific, degree or anything like that. You have to have passion. And if it's a question you can't answer, you know where to go. Let me tell you quickly, the Ironbound community. And we all probably know about the facility that was grandfathered in or protected because it wasn't, I'm sorry, grandfathered in.
For those listening at home, that's Newark, New Jersey.
Yes. No, no, no. I said Ironbound. I'm sorry. I meant Ivy City.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Both are, but you know what? The example could be applicable to both, and that is Newark, New Jersey. I used to live there, not in Ironbound, but in Newark. So exactly right. So you could take it for either one. But in the Ivy City, and I can talk about that a little bit because um, the Empower DC is one of the partners on our EPA Region 3 Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Grant, right? And they have been fighting this facility that is adjacent to, and by adjacent, they share a wall, homes where children live.
Right.
And you have pollutants being emitted regularly into the environment. They aren't um, held
They grandfathered
accountable.
in.
Yeah, they aren't held accountable by any law, any legislation. But the community is reaching out to different people who can help them and provide guidance and testing or let them help them learn how to do monitoring because, community science, or some folks call it citizen science. I say community science is the way to go. You just give people the opportunity, they'll do their own monitoring. They already, when I was in Florida, I'm in Florida now, but when I was in Tallahassee, the Department of Environment kept saying, we don't know why this property is polluted. We can't figure it out. We can't figure it out. The underground storage tanks are over here. The pollution is here. A resident said one day, oh, they used to have cattle vat dips where you'd walk the cattle into these cement vats in the ground, and then they walk out the other side dripping pesticides through the pasture. Well, that wasn't documented anywhere. So no, so the government wouldn't know that, but the historic knowledge, you see, that's how important. So that's how people can, speak for themselves. Sorry, Vernice, did I interrupt you?
No, not at all. Adrienne is right. We when I stopped being mad at EPA, and I was really, really, really mad at EPA Region 2 for a very, very, very long time, years. Even when I was a member of the NEJAC, I could have a sane conversation with other people at EPA, but I could not tolerate the people at Region 2. And a dear friend of mine, Dr. Marva King, who was one of the longest serving and earliest members of the staff of the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA, we were coming out of a NEJAC meeting, and I had belligerently talked to some folks from EPA Region 2 who were in the session with us. And Marva said to me, as soon as we got out the room, she and I were on our way to dinner, and she said, what if somebody talked to your beloved the way you talked to those people at EPA Region 2? My beloved worked for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services before he retired after 30 years of service. But this was well before Charles retired. And I stopped in my tracks, Chris, and I was like, what? Talk to Charles that way? Somebody? And she kept walking. And I stood there like shook by the question, right? And then she was like about a block away, and she turned around and she throws her hands up. She's like, what are you doing? And she walked back. And I said, I am trying to process what you said to me. And she said, everyone is somebody's loved one. Everyone is of value to someone. And you got to stop talking to those people like that. And then Chris said, so she said, why don't you change your strategy and your approach? Right. And why don't you see if by sitting down at the table with them, you might be able to, to make progress on this issue. But you got to let up on the consistently be, belittling these people who are doing their best to do their jobs, right?
Absolutely.
So another thing that floated in my mind when I was having that conversation with her, Chris, is that my grandmother, knowing her first grandchild as well as she did, used to tell me this all the time. You catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And you would have thought my grandmother, who was a nurse, was trying to teach me quantum physics. I just could not wrap my head around what my grandmother was trying to tell me. And so I think it was the same year that Marva had made that comment to me, which would have been 1996. I was at a conference that all the air division directors, I think it used to be called STAPA ALAPCO, was the acronym. I forget what, they have a new name. I forget what it is now, but it's all the state environmental agency air division directors. They have an annual conference, or maybe biannual, and EPA comes. And I was dispatched along with Rob Brenner, who was at the time, Rob was the director of policy in the Office of Air and Radiation at EPA. He then eventually would become the deputy assistant administrator and then the assistant administrator. But Rob and I had been dispatched to go to that conference to explain to them EPA's first Title VI civil rights guidance and why these state agencies needed to be in compliance with it. And so, I'm giving my spiel about what's happening in West Harlem. And this guy gets up, this black guy gets up, and he says, Vernice, what do you need? I was like, what do you mean? What do I need? And he says, what do you need? And I lean over to Rob and I said, Rob, who is that? He said, that's the Air Division Director in EPA Region 2. Those people you're always belittling, those are his people, right? And so he really caught me off guard. And I said, I don't know, we need air monitors. And he says, well, how many air monitors do you need? I'm making this up as I go along. I was like, I don't know, 50, 60. He said, okay, we'll get you the air monitors. He says, how about this? I'll get you the air monitors and you organize the meeting with the community because the community members should tell us where the air monitors should go.
I
And I
like that.
said, okay. So we did that. And they brought those monitors and they put those mobile monitors up all over the community. And that is how we found out that we had the highest level of exposure to PM 2.5, right?
Mm.
And it was literally a shift in a meeting, right? A shift in energy. He stood up, he heard the issue, and he immediately his head goes, well, shoot, we could do something about that. We could at least monitor the air quality for them to let
Yeah.
them know what's going on. And that shifted my whole way of working with other people at EPA, but with other regulators. That maybe the way to resolve some of these issues is to sit around the table, right? To understand what the issues are. Both we understand their perspective and they understand our perspective, and then do some common work together at what solution making looks like, right? And for my part, as a policy person, I then got into trying to write regulations, which I did a lot of,
Mm.
through the NEJAC and through other formats. But people will understand whatever they need to understand. And when I tell you, I am not like Dr. Hollis. I do not have a science background. In fact, before I went to graduate school, I had never seen or heard of an environmental course because there was none at my college. There was nothing that I could have taken. So I went to planning school 10 years later after college. And that was the first time that I even began to encounter the land use issues in an academic setting. But there really wasn't anything I could study that would
Yeah.
have prepared me for what I would eventually go on to do. So I'm a classic example of someone who learned intimately the science, the policy, the engineering that is involved in how the system should work and who's not being protected and why are people being left out of, what is for other communities, air pollution monitoring works,
Yeah.
right? For other people, when they see those dials and those levels go up above a certain level, all hell breaks loose. And everybody goes and people try to figure out what's the source of the contamination. What do we need to do? It doesn't happen where we live. And we've been trying to change that dynamic for 40 years.
Yeah, kind of following off that also kind of reminds me of what I do. I spend a lot of my time talking to industry, frankly, trying to do this thing the right way. As, to be extremely honest, most of them. Um, trying to put policies and plans in place, but also get, having a history of getting frustrated about not wanting to say the wrong thing, not wanting to do the wrong thing. Paraphrasing here, I'm following my permit. What more can you ask of me? And I spend a lot of time talking to these guys, like, hey, if you don't understand EJ and climate impacts as potential risks, you're really kind of missing it. And that if these things aren't addressed early in the process here, it's actually also going to be bad for your bottom line. I don't know if that's something either of you have any thoughts on you might want to address.
Well, I mean, I agree with that. Um, I totally agree with your approach and what you're doing. I decided, I think I take a slightly now, given where we are in this moment, my approach is more non-traditional partnerships and how they can help you. For example, we wrote an application for a grant a couple of months ago. We didn't get it, but we were partnering with a group that prepares emergency kits. For it was originally designed for earthquakes in California. And our whole the vision is, I've spoken with some communities and they need these kits. We call them grab and go kits, where they can include, prescription information, even medication, your ID. Um, you know, we had some emergency supplies. Raincoat, solar powered battery so you can charge your phone, and just a bunch of, things, but in a carry case so that you wouldn't have to add it to your luggage. And the partnership with, gosh, was something new. It was something new for them. And I was kind of hoping they would do it for free, but they were going to give us the government discount. Um, but I think the approach is to me, the approach is how does this affect you, not because you're industry, but because you're people who happen to work in industry? And what's your responsibility because of where you work? What is your responsibility to the people? And now the problem with that, Chris and Bernice, sometimes is if when people decide to put profit over people, right, over lives. And then when you talk to them about things like data centers, right, which Bernice, we know a lot about, not enough, but um, people are like, yeah, but we make such and such money. Or if I talk to people in Florida, sugar capital of the world, whatever, about to stop um, sugarcane burning because it pollutes the environment, and you have minority communities downwind. And there's a whole nother way to do business. And we hear things like, yeah, but it's expensive. Well, how much is a life worth? So I feel like the approach from another approach, because all these things can work depending on who you're working with, is here's an opportunity for education and making them see how this affects them. Because people traditionally separate themselves on purpose so that they won't have to think about that, they don't want to make it personal. So that's just my take on it.
Yep.
That's Bernice, yep.
And I think that sums it up with the yup.
Yep.
That's it.
What
Now,
she
one thing
said.
I wanted to touch on, I know we're starting to get up on time a little bit, but I want to not address this. Um, I go to great lengths, frankly, on this podcast, not to be political, and I don't want to be, but
Yeah.
there have been a lot of changes at the federal level over the last ballpark half a year that unfortunately have people out of work, have grants not coming through, have programs not being followed through on. And can you both speak a little bit from an EJ and climate perspective, how those changes will affect both the work you're currently doing and where we could have been at this point?
Can we, I'll go
Well,
first. Yeah, you want to go first.
well, um, a couple things. Charles Lee has recently written a piece, and Bob Bullard has been talking about it a lot and posting about it, that we had a moment. That moment lasted for 4 years with the Biden administration. But Adrienne can tell you from day one of the administration, particularly after we first passed Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law and then the IRA, I would say all the time in public comments that this is extraordinary, but it's not going to last, right? This is not, it's not going to roll like this forever. I was actually dumbfounded that the amount of resources that the federal government amassed to provide in grants and infrastructure investments and programmatic investments and climate justice and energy justice and energy efficient housing, and it was comprehensive, right? It was comprehensive because we have been building this agenda for decades, right? And with every presidential administration, Democratic and Republican, from 1990 forward, we had been pushing this public policy agenda, and it reached its zenith with President Biden. And people should know, I think the reason why it reached its zenith with President Biden is because when his family moved from Scranton, Pennsylvania to Delaware, they moved into a town that was across the river from an active refinery in Delaware. In Delaware or South Jersey? In South Jersey. And every day I heard him say this with my own ears on an interview he was on CNN. It was a town hall, and it was in that period in between when he was elected and when he was sworn in. And the moderator asked him, "You seem to have a passion about environmental issues. Why is that?" And he said, "Because when we moved from Scranton to Delaware, um, uh, every day when my mother would load us up in the car to take us to school, it was my job as the oldest child and the oldest son to wipe down the windshield and the windshield wipers from a thin coat of oil that was on our car every single day when
Wow.
we would get ready to go to school. So we couldn't leave until I had cleaned off the windows. He said, so nobody has to explain to me what it means to live in a place where the lives of the people who live there are not valued. And I remember saying to myself, holy shit, Joe Biden lived in an EJ community. I'll be damned. Right.
Mm.
Of all the things I thought about him, and I always liked him, but I just had no idea it was so personal to him. So Adrienne can tell you, we skipped over a lot of nonsense that we went through with every administration before that. We had to explain ourselves. We had to research ourselves. We had to write untold volumes of paper
Mm.
to justify the policy directions that we were asking them to do. We did not have to do that with this administration. Now, that's not to say that we were in agreement about everything, but we were in agreement about 75% of everything, and the rest of it we could work on, and we did work on, right? But we made a quantum leap forward, but I knew it wasn't going to last. Now, I didn't know the curtain was going to fall on January 20th. I didn't think it was going to come to a screeching halt that quickly or that suddenly. But we did not get here because the federal government was aligned with us. We did not arrive at the place that we arrived at because philanthropy was completely behind us and investing in our organizations. Or state agencies were doing their maximum that they could do to provide equal protection before the law to our communities and our residents. That is not how we got here. We got here the same way we made all the other civil rights and human rights progress that we have made in this nation, by fighting, by litigating, by advocating, by being in the streets, by organizing, by having the faith community in partnership, by young people being on the front lines. And we continue to do that, and we will continue to do that. And nobody should get comfortable with the fact that, oh, they were giving out billions of dollars, so we just have to wait and that time is going to come around again. I would say I don't think that time is going to come around again. But I know that with nothing, we made a whole lot of something. And we are not beholden to federal money or philanthropic money. We did most of what we did with no money at all, but with the sheer will and the rightness of our cause, right? The rightness of our cause.
Yep. And I'm a piggyback. Well, take that to the next level, which is one particular example. The National Wildlife Federation was the parent on a grant with University of Maryland, Dr. Jacoby Wilson, which is one of EPA's the money that Vernice talked about, where they amass money to help communities. And this was called Thriving Communities, and this particular one was technical assistance centers.
The
We were
Tic Tacs.
developing them, and so we're Region 3. And we still are. I think of it as we still are. Of
Mm.
course, when this administration in February 21st at 7:15 in the morning, I got a Saturday morning, got an email that we needed to cease and desist all activities related to the Tic Tac,
I kind of love
as
that
we
you still
call it.
remember the time.
Oh yeah, because I rolled over and was like, what? And I couldn't. I was like, I'm not looking at this correctly, because we were just in year 2 of a 5-year grant, $12 million grant. Now, of course, that the majority of the money was going to the communities. We got very, very little of it, and that's the way it should be. But the one response that I will never forget is that when we had a meeting with communities, because I was sharing this information about this, it just got this cease and desist, blah, blah, blah. One of our wonderful community, we call them, they're subawardees, the official name, but they're our hub partners. They are the technical assistance centers, right? This one happens to be they work in Southern Delaware and in parts of rural Maryland. And she just said, but we have this community that needs our help, and was very emotional. We still have them. We still have people. I mean, we had people waiting in the wings who were, we were just getting to the point where, what do you need and who can we get to, who's going to give it to you? And she was so emotional because she was like, this community is having a refinery built in their midst. People are still doing that from the early days. And so what this created, what this political conundrum created, is a situation where people are left high and dry with no assistance. and we can do what I know I did when I was at FAMU, Florida A&M, was go for, you just went. I'd bring my students and we'd be 8 deep in a room, one bedroom, I mean, one hotel room, because we didn't have any money.
Hmm.
All we got enough money for gas to go down there. There is no funding. We had this moment, this in time, as Vernice said, well, there was funding. There was more funding than there's ever been for EJ communities. And I agree with you. I don't think that's going to happen to that extent again. But we are litigating. I mean, NWF isn't, but people who have this grant, we are following that, and people are litigating. And we're watching what happened with Green and Healthy Homes and their thriving communities, um, grant, and what's happening with the litigation that Southern Environmental Law Center, Lawyers for Good Government, Earth Justice, and others are leading,
Yep.
because it's not fair. And I'm not don't want to talk politics either, but there comes a point, Chris, in my mind, where you have to call a thing what it is. And, because anything else is ignoring history, ignoring where we are, and it's an insult to who we are,
Yeah.
because we want to downplay it. And you can't do that and expect anything to change.
Interesting. Only because we're coming up on time here a little bit. Honestly, frankly, I could talk to you guys both for a couple of hours, especially on these topics. But this podcast has been doing incredibly well for a lot of reasons. We're in 70 countries now, which I'm incredibly humbled about. Um, but our largest demographic is young people, people who care about these issues and want to try to get involved and might not immediately understand how to or why to, but possibly just understand that, hey, there's a problem here. I want to try to do something about it. Is there anything, Adrienne, that you would say to them?
Yes, and I used to say it, and I don't think people really got it, is that there's no one path to get to where you need to be to do this work. Because if you just sit here and learn that Bernice and I have different and yet similar pathways. And I always when I get an opportunity, tell students, chart your path. Think about what you need. I mean, mine is all over the place the way I got here, because it doesn't exist like that. So, you get all the skills you think you're going to need to be successful in this work. And the first skill you need is passion. And that's a state of being, because you've got to believe that this is not a job. It's a calling, right? And you've got to feel that, because if you feel that, the other things are going to come easily. And by easily, I mean you're going to be able to identify what's needed. It may not be, it ain't free, but it's easy to say, oh, I need to get some experience in this, or I need to learn about urban planning because our community is flooding all the time, or something like that, right? And so that's what I would say. Don't look for a formula. Don't look for don't look at somebody else's track. You have to think about what you need in order to do the type of work you want to do.
All right,
And you have to,
Vernice, I'm going to allow you final thoughts here, young people.
well, you have to believe in yourself.
Yes.
When you hear Adrienne tell her story or me tell mine, there is no path out there that would have brought that little Black girl from Mobile, Alabama, or that little Black girl from Harlem. There is no path. And, mind you, I went to a university that was in Harlem, right? An Ivy League institution. You could count the people over generations from our community that had actually gotten into and gone to that university. It was not built for us. Even though it was in our part of town, it was not built for us. Surely there were not a whole lot of people like Adrienne who did what she did, but somebody told us that they had high expectations for us. And we looked around and we saw all these people that were not getting what they needed. And then we just went about figuring out in a very circuitous way, there was no straight line, as Adrienne said, what can I do to help my people, right? What can I do? What should I be doing? And we found those places. And so I would say that young people need to ask themselves that question. What can you do to help the people around you so that their lives are better? So that the people coming up behind you, your own family members, right? What can I do? What should I be doing? How can I make my mark? How can I make a contribution? And maybe again back to where we have some self-responsibility. Adrienne and I grew up in a time when we could look on the news and see what the people were doing, fighting for us, right? And sacrificing their lives. So we had great examples of people being out there. We had great examples of students putting their lives on the line to give people access to college and to university, right? And I wonder if we have slacked off in the models
Mm.
of what it means to be servant leaders, what it means to dedicate yourself and your work to service of others. There's a lot of, I was just talking about this at a wonderful church here in the DMV, the Alfred Street Baptist Church on Saturday, a church that has been in existence for 200 years. They were established 30 years before slavery was ended in Alexandria, Virginia. And I said, what is the role of the Black church these days? How are we showing up? We know how we used to show up, but now we tend to show up as the prosperity gospel. Now I'm getting off into a whole other thing, but where people go to church and they pray for abundance. I mean, material abundance as opposed to spiritual abundance. And we got to course correct to get back in a place where we're fighting on behalf of how can we make sure everybody's needs are met, that everybody has what they need, that no one is being discriminated against, that people are not having the very air they breathe poisoned. What do we need to do? And the answers are out here. And the young people got the answers, right?
Yeah.
They got the science, they got the technology, they got the smarts, they got gifts.
Yeah.
And the I think the challenge is how do we create the space for them to deploy those gifts in a way that continues to move forward, to move us all forward collectively.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're giving them the best examples, but I know that we're headed down the wrong path if we don't course correct.
Yeah. And Chris, quickly, they have to
Yeah.
have the understanding that you don't stop asking that question. You
Yes, I agree
always
with that.
ask it. I 20 years after I got my PhD, I asked the community, what is it that you need?
Yeah,
We need lawyers who look like us, who can explain things to us that we trust.
yeah.
And I went to law school like that. So you have to always be ready to pivot, right, Bernice, or add something new or provide some
Always,
skill. It's not a
always,
one-time question.
And
So,
always
always.
continue learning too, and don't assume that you know everything.
right.
And frankly, I'm wearing Stars and Stripes today just to kind of drive home a point that I love a lot of what this country was built around and what it's supposed to be. But people have to understand that not everyone gets that. Not everyone has the opportunity for the same access to what all this is supposed to be about. There's
Right.
nothing wrong with admitting that and trying to learn from past errors, but you have to put the effort in to learn and understand that there's a quote that I love that popped into my head as Vernice was speaking. If I was seen further, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants,
Mm.
people who have come before and busted their butts, frankly, for things that they were passionate about and made the types of concrete gains, health impact benefits, environmental benefits that have happened over the last couple of years, but still understand that there's further to go. So
Yeah.
Yes.
with that, I want to say thank you very, very much, both of you. I enjoyed this
Thank you so
time.
much.
And everyone listening, have a nice day. And if you haven't already, please follow us on Spotify, YouTube, the other zillion platforms I'm not thinking of right now, Apple, and have a nice day.